If it hadn't been for the case number on these intake photos, you might have assumed that John Venables and Robert Thompson were simply posing for class photos. But past the surface, these two seemingly ordinary 10-year-old boys held a darkness inside them that would be unleashed on a golden afternoon in 1993, that would end with the death of a 2-year-old boy, and would shock the UK to its core. Both Venables and Thompson had reportedly rough upbringings. The fifth of 7 children, Thompson came from a broken home with an alcoholic, suicidal mother and an absent father. John Venables also came from a home with separated parents, and while his father was still a presence in his life, it was reported that his mother was abusive to young John. The pair would bond over their similar dysfunctional families and pain in life and became fast friends. They were known troublemakers, both acting out through petty crimes like vandalism and theft from local shops. But on February 12, 1993, the pair would take their criminal acts to a horrifying new level, with the kidnapping and murder of a young boy. James Bulger, 2 years old, was out shopping with his mother Denise Fergus at New Strand Shopping Centre in Bootle, England. Denise had been holding her young son's hand while they grocery shopped, but while at the butcher, she briefly let go to pay for her items, only to look down in horror and realize her child was gone. Thompson and Venables had taken advantage of this momentary lapse in attention and spirited the little boy out of the shop before his mother knew what had happened. Denise Fergus later lamented what any parent might have in this tragic situation. Quote, "I shouldn't have let go of his hand. That was the biggest mistake of my life. I shouldn't have let go." Unquote. Shockingly, though, little James Bulger had not been the first child that the pair attempted to snatch that day. They first attempted to lure a 3-year-old girl and her 2-year-old brother away from the shops, but were unsuccessful before settling on James. CCTV cameras at the shopping center caught the 3 children walking outside at 3:42 p.m. By then, a panicked Denise Fergus had already alerted mall security, and a search was on for the little boy, but to no avail. By 4:15 p.m., there was no sign of him at the center, and he was quickly reported missing to the police. While police searched for James Bulger, Robert Thompson and John Venables were leading the toddler far away from the mall and into another town. There were many witnesses who saw the 3 on the streets walking and noted the rough treatment of Bulger by what they assumed to be older siblings. A few stopped to ask the boys questions, but ultimately would let the children go on their way, believing that Bulger was being taken home or to a police station. Many would later express deep regret that they had seen the boy and done nothing. These people would be the last ones to see James Bulger alive, other than his killers. Thompson and Venables would eventually make their way to a railway track near Walton. It was here that they began to torture young James. They would splash stolen blue paint in the boy's eyes, blinding him. Then they took turns bludgeoning him with stones and bricks, shoving batteries in his mouth. The killing blow eventually came from a strike on the head with a 22-pound iron bar. This blow alone resulted in 10 skull fractures. By the time of his death, James Bulger's tiny body had sustained 42 brutal injuries in total. The little boy's final, heartbreaking words were, "I want my mum." After murdering their victim, the 2 killers would place the young boy's body on the train tracks in order to cover their tracks and make the child's death appear an accident. A train would eventually come along and run over the remains, cutting the body in half. But it was plain to the group of horrified teenagers who discovered the body 2 days later that this was no accident. It didn't take long for police to hone in on the 2 boys after receiving an anonymous tip that the 2 had been involved in a child's murder. The authorities had already been looking through the lists of children who had been absent from local schools since they had the abductors of James Bulger on camera, but they originally assumed that the boys were older, in their teens, which threw the initial search off track. Once they were tipped off with the names of Venables and Thompson, police checked and confirmed that both boys had indeed been truant the day of the murder. Also, Venables had been seen with blue paint on his jacket, the same color used to blind and torture Bulger. Police soon checked both boys' homes. Not only did they confirm the blue paint on Venables' jacket, but they also found blood on Thompson's shoes. The boys were arrested on February 18th, less than a week after the murder, and it didn't take long for the pair to turn on each other. At first, Thompson, who was assumed to be the ringleader in the murder, denied everything, but Venables quickly caved under the pressure of questioning. He blurted out, quote, "I didn't kill him. What about his mom? Will you tell her I'm sorry?" Unquote. Thompson tried hard not to incriminate himself, but inadvertently did so when he managed to give a detailed account of what James Bulger had been wearing on the day of his death. After questioning the pair, Detective Phil Roberts said, quote, "As far as I'm concerned, that day I stared evil in the face. They were a match made in hell, a freak of nature. They went out that day to kill. I truly believe that. And if they hadn't been caught, I fear they would have struck again." Unquote. The boys would be brought to trial, where again, the cold and emotionless Thompson was portrayed as the leader, while the more emotional Venables was depicted as the follower who was doing his friend's bidding. Court psychiatrists examined both boys and astonishingly declared that neither was a sociopath, and both expressed that they knew the difference between right and wrong. They were unable to find a distinct motive for the horrific crime, and it remains unknown to this day. On November 24th, 1993, Robert Thompson and John Venables were found guilty of the abduction and murder of James Bulger, making the pair the youngest convicted killers in British history. The pair were ordered to remain in prison until review when they turned 18. They were both released from prison in June 2001. They were also both given new identities and have taken distinctly different paths since their release. Robert Thompson, portrayed as the ringleader of the violent attack, has never reoffended since his release. Little is known of his current whereabouts, but he is reportedly in a stable relationship with a man who is aware of his past. As for Venables, he has been thrown in prison multiple times since his initial release, notably for possession of child pornography and a, quote, pedophile manual that described how to abuse young girls in disgusting detail. He was arrested most recently for possession of child pornography in 2017 and sentenced to 40 months in 2018. He was denied parole in 2020. James Bulger's father, Ralph, agrees with the decision and has voiced his opinion to keep Venables behind bars. Quote, "I believe the only way to prevent him from killing another baby like James is to keep him locked up for life. How can anyone say this monster is safe to live among us ever again?" In perhaps what is a case of abuse trauma taken to deadly extremes is the strange murder that occurred in 1998 in Jacksonville, Florida, involving then 14-year-old Joshua Phillips and his neighbor, 8-year-old Maddie Clifton. Phillips was originally born in Allentown, Pennsylvania on St. Patrick's Day, 1984, to Steve and Melissa Phillips. Though it was a less than idyllic childhood, Steve was a violent alcoholic and drug addict who often took his rage out on his wife and child. He would impose strict rules on young Joshua, including getting angry if he had other children in the house, if Steve or Melissa were not home. He particularly seemed to have an animosity towards young girls, though Melissa said she never understood why her husband felt this way. This strict rule would come into play in the worst way many years later. By age 14, Joshua had moved with his parents to Jacksonville, Florida. Neighbors described the teenager as, quote, quiet and friendly. His teacher said he was a popular student, fun and silly. He had no prior run-ins with the law and had no arrests or history of violence prior to that fateful November day. Even the victim's mother said that her daughter and Phillips were friends and she had no reason to be afraid of him. That would soon drastically change, and two families' lives would change forever. According to Joshua Phillips, on November 3rd, 1998, he was home alone when Maddie Clifton, his 8-year-old neighbor from across the road, came over, asking him to come outside and play baseball. Phillips agreed, even though according to the strict rules imposed by his father, he was not allowed to have any friends over while his parents were not home. As the two were playing, Phillips accidentally hit the ball into Maddie's eye, hard enough to cause her to bleed. She started to scream and cry, and Phillips claimed he panicked, knowing his father would be home soon and fearing his likely violent reaction. But what Phillips did next seemed to defy all rational explanation. Phillips claimed that in order to hide the fact that he had disobeyed and to keep Clifton from screaming, he dragged her inside his house. He claims that the clothing on her lower body came off at this time while she was dragged. He would strike the small girl with a baseball bat again to stop her from screaming before shoving her under the base of the waterbed in his room. When Steve returned home, Phillips interacted with him as if nothing had happened. He then returned to his room and, upon hearing small moans from the bed, realized Maddie was still alive. Instead of owning up to the assault, which was already beyond the pale, Phillips decided to take it one fatal step further. He would remove the mattress from his bed, then take the knife from a Leatherman tool and slit the little girl's throat and stab her in the chest 7 times, finally killing her. He would place the body back under the bed with the mattress on top of it, leaving the evidence of the brutal murder to be later discovered. Maddie's disappearance had not gone unnoticed, and she was reported missing around 5 p.m. the day she died. Police and volunteers would search for the 8-year-old for 6 days, with her killer even joining in the search himself. Phillips would later say that he was living in a state of denial in the week before the body was discovered. Quote, "I was putting myself in a fantasy world where nothing happened. That was my defense mechanism for everything when I was a kid. I never made the decision to ignore it, I just did." Unquote. But his crime wouldn't go undiscovered for long. On November 10th, Melissa Phillips would go into her son's room and notice a wet spot on the floor. Assuming it was the waterbed that had sprung a leak and that the leaking water was the source of the strange smell in the room, she moved the mattress and, instead of a hole, discovered the decomposing remains of the missing Maddie Clifton. Melissa ran out of the front door of the home and reported her findings to police. She recalls leading the officer to Joshua's room. Quote, "I just pointed to where they needed to look. I couldn't even go in." Unquote. Joshua Phillips would be arrested at school and taken into police custody, where he confessed to the murder within hours. 4 days after his confession, the Cliftons buried their youngest daughter. Joshua Phillips would be tried as an adult for the crime. The trial was moved to Polk County over concerns of publicity and media coverage in Jacksonville. During the trial, the prosecution would contest Phillips' version of events, with State Attorney Harry Shorstein suggesting that the murder was sexually motivated. The prosecution provided testimony that Phillips had discussed sex with both Maddie and her older sister on previous occasions, and while the autopsy found no evidence of sexual assault, the argument was made that the lack of dirt and sand on Clifton's body did not support Phillips' account that her clothing came off as she was being dragged across the yard into his room. Prosecutors also noted that no blood was found in the backyard where the initial strike with the baseball occurred, nor was there any blood found on the bat used to strike Maddie. They claimed that this did not support Phillips' version of events. Meanwhile, the defense took on the risky tactic of not calling a single witness in Phillips' defense. The defense attorney, Richard D. Nichols, would also insist that Phillips himself not take the stand, intending to leave the bulk of the defense to the closing argument to the jury, where he stated that Clifton's death was, quote, "an act that began as an accident and deteriorated through panic that bordered on madness." According to Phillips himself, Nichols never even attempted to question him over the events of the murder, instead opting to play chess with him whenever he visited Phillips in prison prior to the trial. Joshua's mother, Melissa, disagreed with this strategy, but Steve insisted to allow the attorney to do as he pleased. During the trial, the defense did attempt to admit evidence brain scans from a neurologist that showed bilateral lesions on the frontal lobe of Phillips' brain, which are often associated with panic and impaired judgment, while the prosecution attempted to submit evidence of pornography that Phillips had been looking at on his computer. Both pieces of evidence were ultimately ruled inadmissible. The trial only lasted 2 days due to the lack of defense witnesses, and it only took the jury just over 2 hours to find Joshua Phillips guilty of first-degree murder. He would be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, since he was not eligible for the death penalty due to the fact that he was under 16. In 2000, Steve Phillips was killed in a car accident while Melissa Phillips continued to seek a new trial for her son. Several appeals have occurred in the case since the original conviction. In 2008, 2 of the officials most responsible for Phillips' life sentence, Harry Shorstein and Sheriff Nat Glover, admitted having second thoughts about giving a life sentence without the possibility of parole to a 14-year-old. Shorstein said that he regretted not offering Phillips a second-degree murder plea, which would have given the judge more discretion in sentencing, and has voiced his support for eventual clemency or parole for Phillips. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling on Miller v. Alabama declared sentencing juveniles to mandatory life sentences without parole as unconstitutional. In September 2016, Phillips' new legal team successfully used this ruling to be granted a new sentence hearing, which was held in 2017. After hearing Maddie Clifton's mother testify at the hearing that she wished the sentence to be upheld, the decision was made to keep Phillips in prison. He was resentenced to life, but is eligible for resentencing again in 2023. Thrill killer. Not generally the 2 words one would associate with a teenager described by friends as, quote, always so sweet and everybody loved her. She was just amazing. But the other side of 15-year-old Alyssa Bustamante, as her internet persona would reveal, was far darker than anyone would suspect. By all accounts, Alyssa Bustamante had a troubled and non-traditional upbringing. Her mother, Michelle, had a history of drug and alcohol abuse, and both of her parents had run-ins with the law. Her father, Cesar, was serving time in jail for assault. So between 2002 and 2009, Alyssa was raised by her grandparents. She moved with her 3 younger siblings from their former home in California to a large rural ranch outside of Jefferson City, Missouri. She would regularly attend church activities at a local Mormon church and consistently got A's and B's in school despite the less than ideal start in life with her parents. By all external appearances and to her friends, Alyssa Bustamante was a normal teenager. But appearances, as we know, can be deceiving. In 2007, Alyssa attempted suicide and spent 10 days in a psychiatric hospital undergoing treatment. She was prescribed antidepressants, but in spite of the medication, Alyssa continued to practice self-harm behaviors like cutting. Friends said she would frequently show them the scars on her wrists. This depression and vulnerability was quite the different persona than Alyssa portrayed online. Her Twitter feed boasted of how much she hated authority. One post read, "Bad decisions make great stories." Her hobbies on YouTube and MySpace were listed as cutting and killing people. She also posted a video on her YouTube channel attempting to get her twin younger brothers to intentionally touch an electric fence. She would post lurid selfies with dark makeup and fake bloodstains, feigning violent poses. A stark contrast from the girl who would write poems and tell jokes and attend church groups with her friends. For a while, it seemed the violence was contained to blogs and social media. Then came October 21st, 2009, and a callous crime that would shock the public. 4 houses down from the Bustamante family lived 9-year-old Elizabeth Olten. She would often come over to play with Alyssa and her younger siblings. On the night of the murder, Elizabeth's mother said she begged her to go over to Alyssa's to play. This was 5 p.m., and the last time Elizabeth's mother, Patty Price, would see her child alive. After an hour passed and there was no sign and no word from Elizabeth, her mother knew something was terribly wrong. By 7 p.m. that evening, the police were called and the child was reported missing. A search began almost immediately. The patrols included dogs, firefighters, police helicopters, FBI, and highway patrol. They combed the area but came up empty-handed. Initially, Elizabeth's cell phone pinged in the woods where her body would eventually be located, but by Thursday morning, the battery in the phone had died. But it wasn't an older male predator who had lured away the little girl who loved cats in the color pink. It was someone much closer to home. A letter would point the police's suspicions toward Alyssa. They searched her home and seized her diary, and after questioning, the teenager confessed to luring little Elizabeth Olton to the woods before strangling her, cutting her throat, and stabbing her in the chest. She would then bury the body in one of the several shallow graves she dug behind her home in the woods, before covering it with leaves and returning home. Elizabeth had been missing for only 45 minutes before her mother alerted the authorities, and that was all the time it took for Alyssa to snuff out the child's life, because she wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. The journal that was seized by police contained an entry, one that Alyssa had attempted to cross out in blue ink, but once unveiled, revealed a horrible confession. Quote, "I just fucking killed someone. I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them. Now they're dead. I don't know how to feel at the moment. It was amazing. As soon as you get over the, oh my god, I can't do this feeling, it's pretty enjoyable. I'm kinda nervous and shaky though right now. 'Kay, gotta go to church now, LOL. Alyssa spent the rest of the evening after the murder at a church dance. Alyssa admitted to the authorities to digging 2 graves a week before the murders, which led to speculation that her twin brothers, the ones she had shown getting electrocuted in the YouTube video, may have been the original intended victims, but she saw Elizabeth coming over as an opportunity for murder that she could not pass up. Alyssa Bustamante would be charged and tried as an adult. The defense would attempt to point to Alyssa's troubled childhood and mental health issues in order to apply leniency, but the state was still determined to seek the death penalty. A few weeks before the trial began, about 2 years after the murder had occurred, Alyssa would accept a plea deal to the lesser charge of second-degree murder in order to avoid the death penalty. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison before she had a chance at parole. Elizabeth's mother, Patty Price, would call Bustamante an evil monster and barely human, and said she hated her at the sentencing. Alyssa Bustamante is eligible for parole in 2024. Bullying is sadly all too common amongst children. Most people can recall being bullied or picked on by others when they were younger. But can bullying turn someone into a cold-blooded killer? That was the argument in the case of 13-year-old Derrick Smith. Derrick lived with his grandparents, Red and Edie Wilson, in the small town of Savona, New York. Red said of his grandson, quote, "He would always come in and give us hugs and kisses. He liked being a clown," unquote. But this outward appearance masked a boy who, with his bright red hair, protruding ears, thick glasses, and freckles, had become a frequent target for bullies at school. Derrick was often described as a loner and an outcast who had no friends amongst his peer group. Perhaps this was why he sought out younger children, like 4-year-old Derrick Roby. Derrick was a friendly boy, according to his parents, who liked to wave at everyone that passed by when he was out riding his bike. He was attending a day camp a block away from his home in the summer of 1993. Derrick Smith, who was often seen pedaling his bike around town alone, was also attending the program. On August 2nd, Derrick was set to go to camp, but his mother wasn't ready to take him yet, as the new baby was being a bit fussy. Doreen Roby recalled, quote, "Derrick said, 'It's okay, Mom, I'll go by myself. He gave me a kiss and I said, I love you, and he says, I love you, Mom, and he went hopping off the sidewalk,' unquote. The day camp was only a block away, with no streets to cross. The park where the camp was being held was on a dead-end street. there seemed to be little danger in a town of less than 1,000 people, where everyone seemed to know the little boy who waved at their cars as they drove by his street. Quote, "It was the first time I had ever let him go anywhere alone," Doreen Roby recalled later. Unfortunately for Derrick Roby, Eric Smith was heading his direction after having been kicked out of the same day camp for bad behavior that day. Approximately 5 minutes after leaving his home and saying goodbye to his mother, Derrick Roby was dead. At 11 a.m., Doreen went to the park to pick up her son, only to discover that he had never arrived. After 4 hours of investigation, the little boy's body was later discovered in a small patch of woods, halfway between his home and the park. Evidence showed he had been lured into the woods from the sidewalk, but the killer at the time of the discovery remained unknown. What was known was that whoever lured Derrick into the woods had strangled him, then used nearby rocks to brutally bludgeon the child to death. In what was a final degrading act, the killer also sodomized the boy's body with a stick after death. At the scene, Derrick's lunch bag was found emptied, his snacks smashed and poured out onto the ground. His shoes were removed and left near his hands, leading the authorities to believe that the body had been posed intentionally. Outside of this, there was little physical evidence and fewer leads, but the police wouldn't need to search far for the perpetrator. In fact, he was right in their backyard. On August 8th, Eric Smith would confess to his mother that he had killed Derrick Roby. The Smith family would inform law enforcement later that evening, and Smith would be arrested and charged with the murder of 4-year-old Derrick Roby. The case shocked the media due to the young ages of both the killer and the victim, but the central question of the trial was simply this: why did Eric Smith kill? The defense claimed that Smith suffered from a condition called intermittent explosive disorder, which causes individuals to be violent and unpredictable. The prosecution's expert contested that it is extremely rare to find this condition in someone as young as Smith, but the jury also heard testimony of how Eric would, as a toddler, throw violent temper tantrums and beat his head on the floor. They heard how he had developmental problems, had been held back in school, and had been relentlessly bullied. They laid a case for Eric Smith's untreated anger problems that exploded and unleashed themselves on a defenseless 4-year-old. The prosecution countered that the reason Eric Smith was killed was simply, quote, "Eric chose to do something horrible," unquote. He was extensively examined by both sides, and no imbalance could be found to explain his violent behavior. His mother testified that she had taken an epilepsy medication, Triadone, while she was pregnant with Eric, and while that medication is known to cause birth defects and could certainly be linked to Smith's developmental issues, there was no cogent link between Triadone and violent behavior. On August 16th, Smith was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to the maximum penalty available for juvenile offenders, 9 years to life in prison. While in jail, Smith wrote an apology letter to Roby's family that he read on public television. Quote, "I know my actions have caused a terrible loss in the Roby family, and for that I am truly sorry. I've tried to think as much as possible about what Derrick will never experience. His 16th birthday, Christmas time, any time, owning his own house, graduating, going to college, getting married, his first child. If I could go back in time, I would switch places with Derrick and endure all the pain I've caused him. If it meant that he could go on living, I'd switch places, but I can't," unquote. Smith was eligible for parole beginning in 2001 when he was transferred to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora. He was repeatedly denied parole due to community safety concerns and the Roby family wishing to keep him behind bars. At a 2014 parole hearing, Smith reiterated his remorse for what he had done, and again seemed to blame bullying by other kids as well as his father and older sisters for the reason that his rage exploded and was taken out fatally on Derrick Roby. He was denied parole a total of 10 times since 2002, but was eventually granted parole in October 2021 after being incarcerated for 27 years. Eric Smith, now 42, was ultimately released from prison on February 1st, 2022. The story of Mary Bell is possibly one of the most famous of the children who kill criminal subgenre. It stunned the world not only because of the callousness and brutality of the crimes, as well as the ages of those involved, but that it showed everyone that even children can be psychopaths. In a small community outside of London, England in 1968, it's quite a typical day by all standards, when suddenly the body of a 4-year-old boy is discovered in a boarded-up, condemned house. Martin Brown was found lifeless, with spit and blood trickling down his cheek. Today, an investigation would likely immediately be launched into the suspicious death of a child that young, especially considering where he was found. But that wasn't what happened. Police at the time determined his death to be due to misadventure. The condemned house had been a spot where children were known to sneak in and play, so perhaps it was simply an accident. It wasn't until a second child's body was located in a similar abandoned location that authorities began to suspect foul play. 3-year-old Brian Howe was found strangled in an industrial area where local children were apt to play. And while there wasn't sufficient physical evidence on Martin Brown's body to prove an attack, they had it in spades with the death of poor Brian Howe. He was found with puncture marks on his thigh and partially mutilated genitals, with clumps of his hair cut off. In addition to these gruesome details, Brian was also found to have the letter M scratched into his skin with a razor blade. With the small community of Scotswood in a panic, the police had to determine a suspect. They began by questioning all of the children in the area. During their interviews, 2 young girls stood out to them: Norma Bell, age 13, and Mary Bell, age 11, no relation. Norma, the detective noted, seemed excited by the murder, smiling throughout the questioning. Mary, on the other hand, was quite evasive. At one point, she singled out an 8-year-old boy who lived in the community, claiming that she saw him with Brian the day he was murdered, and that she saw the boy hit Brian. She also claimed to have seen him playing with a pair of scissors. However, the accused boy was at the airport at the time of the murder, and Mary instead had implicated herself in the crime by mentioning the scissors, a detail that was never released to the public. On the day of Brian's funeral, Mary was seen by a detective standing outside of the Howe residence, smiling and laughing as she watched the coffin come out, rubbing her hands together as she did. Norma Bell also attended the funeral and decided to come clean to the police about what she knew of the murder. She claimed that Mary had confessed to her that she killed Brian, and that Mary even brought her to the crime scene later to show her the body. She said Mary described to her in detail how she had strangled Brian and how she had enjoyed it. Mary Bell, of course, denied these allegations and refused to talk aside from pointing the finger back at Norma. Both girls were arrested and charged with the murder of Brian Howe. But what of Martin Brown? Well, as circumstance would have it, leading up to and during the trial, new evidence was uncovered. 2 days after Martin Brown's body was found, a local nursery school was broken into and vandalized. In addition to supplies being thrown about, 4 notes were found at the scene, one which read, quote, "We did murder Martin Brown," and another, quote, "I murder so that I may come back." This odd discovery still wouldn't open a murder investigation into Martin Brown's death, though. The police had already declared Martin's death an accident and presumed the notes were just a sick joke, which proved to be somewhat true since Mary later admitted writing them for, quote, "a giggle." It was also revealed during the trial that the other children heard Mary screaming, "I am a murderer, that's where I killed," while pointing to the house where Brian's body was found. She and Norma had also attacked another 3-year-old boy and throttled 2 other girls only days before the murder of Martin Brown. The authorities had been informed, but due to the girls' young ages, they were simply given warnings, and no further action was taken. Mary was apparently not shy about her murders or her murderous inclinations. She had even told her guards at one point that she liked, quote, hurting little things that can't fight back. Clearly, this was an unprecedented case of juvenile psychopathy. But what had happened to this young girl to make her such a monster? It may have begun with her less than idyllic upbringing. When she was born, Mary's mother Betty's less than maternally warm response was, quote, take the thing away from me. As a baby, toddler, and young child, Mary frequently suffered injuries in household accidents while alone with her mother, which led the family to believe that either her mother was deliberately negligent or intentionally attempting to harm or kill her daughter. On one occasion in about 1960, Betty dropped her daughter from a first-floor window. On another occasion, she plied her daughter with sleeping pills. She is also known to have once sold Mary to a mentally unstable woman who was unable to have children of her own, resulting in her older sister Catherine having to travel alone across Newcastle to reclaim Mary from this individual and return the child to her mother's home. Both at home and at school, Mary exhibited numerous signs of disturbed and unpredictable behavior, including mood swings and chronic bedwetting. She is known to have frequently fought with other children, both boys and girls, and have attempted to strangle her classmates or playmates on several occasions. On one such occasion, she is known to have attempted to block the trachea of a young girl with handfuls of sand. Her family also brought several other traumatic stories to light, one being that Mary watched her 5-year-old friend get hit and killed by a bus, another that Mary's mother Betty was a dominatrix and a prostitute and had been alleged to allow Mary to be sexually abused by her clients. It was also said that Betty once lied to several different family members that Mary had been run over by a truck and died. All of these instances quickly begin to paint a picture of the emotionally detached monster that Mary Bell would become, even before reaching puberty. Mary and Norma Bell were both charged with 2 counts of manslaughter. During the trial, they both testified and implicated each other, but still seemed to have a strange bond between them. Something that definitely helped Mary's case were the court-appointed psychologists who testified that Mary had symptoms of psychopathy and was therefore neither coherent or responsible for her actions. On December 17, 1968, Norma was acquitted of all charges. Mary, on the other hand, was convicted of manslaughter due to diminished responsibility. She was supposed to be, quote, detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, which in layman's terms means an indefinite prison sentence, at least until upon review there has been a significant change in the offender's attitude and behavior. After serving 9 years, Mary escaped from prison, but was quickly caught. She could have just waited it out, seeing as how she was released 3 years later in 1980. She was 23 years old upon her release and was granted a new identity in order to start a new life. 4 years later, Mary gave birth to a daughter, and there was much concern over whether or not Mary should be allowed to keep the child considering her past. In the end, she was allowed to keep and raise her daughter. After local authorities in 1998 released Mary's actual identity, the community where she and her daughter were living was outraged. The family had to be relocated. Mary's daughter had no idea of her mother's past. Mary Bell eventually went to court and was granted lifelong anonymity for both her and her daughter, and eventually her granddaughter, who was born in 2009. Mary Bell is still alive and has never reoffended since her release. Her current whereabouts are unknown and remain protected by the 2003 High Court order. According to Gita Sarani, who collaborated with Mary on a biography, Bell does not claim she was wrongly convicted, and freely admits that the abuse she suffered as a child does not excuse her crimes.